Fellow Falcoholics, what is up? Welcome to the Dirty Birds and Brews podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Knight at Falcoholic Kevin, here at the official start of training camp week. We have made it, folks. We are here. We're just days away from the Falcons opening training camp in Flowery Branch. Players report on Tuesday. I believe the first practice is on Wednesday and the first public practice is on Thursday. So we are just about there. We made it through the dead zone, guys. Congratulations. Appreciate everyone who's been following along and hanging out throughout the whole process. And we got one final pre-training camp show for you guys here on the Dirty Birds and Brews podcast, as I will be delivering my pre-training camp Falcons 53-man roster projection. I did one of these right after the draft, and not a lot changed in June. Some years I've done one in June when there's been some significant moves, not a lot happened. So I decided to wait until training camp this year. But from now on, we'll be getting one of these basically every single week, starting with right before the first preseason game, and then so on and so forth, all the way up until right before final cuts. You'll get used to seeing these as we sort of track the changes in player movements throughout training camp. And these are a lot of fun, always, for the roster nerds out there. I'll give you some insight into how I'm looking at the roster math and which position groups have X amount of players and so on and so forth. This is always one of my favorite exercises to do. It gets to scratch that internet GM itch. So really excited to get into this today. Before we do, want to bring you guys a message from our sponsors. First of all, betonline.ag, your number one source for all your sports betting needs. You can get the latest odds, lines, and matchup reports for baseball, boxing, golf, and more. Perhaps you're feeling good about some futures bets, or you're interested in getting into the degeneracy, which is preseason sports betting. No matter what you want to do, though, folks, BetOnline is your sports intel headquarters this season, as they've got you covered for all your insider sports wagering needs. BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to get your betting info, including live betting options and your favorite casino and card games you can play right from your home. So what are you waiting for? Head to the website today or use your mobile device to get in on the action. Be sure to use our promo code BELIEVE. That's BLEAV, just like the network that we're on, Believe. And you put that code in and you will receive a 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit. Bet online, where the game starts. We also are back with Blue Chew this week. This episode is sponsored by Blue Chew. Guys, I know it can be awkward, but let's talk about sex. Remember the days when you were always ready to go? Now you can increase your performance and get that extra confidence in bed. Listen up, BlueChew.com. Blue Chew is a unique online service that delivers the same active ingredients as Viagra, Cialis, and Levitra, but in chewable tablets and at a fraction of the cost. You can take them anytime, day or night, so you can plan ahead or be ready whenever an opportunity arises. The process is simple. Sign up at BlueChew.com, consult with one of their licensed medical providers, and once you're approved, you'll receive your prescription within days. The best part? It's all done online, so no visits to the doctor's office, no awkward conversations, and no waiting in line at the pharmacy. Blue Chew's tablets are made in the USA and prepared and shipped direct to your door in a discreet package. Blue Chew wants to help you have better sex. Discover your options at BlueChew.com. Chew it and do it. We've got a special deal for our listeners. Try Blue Chew free when you use our promo code BUCKET. That's BUCKET at checkout. Just pay $5 in shipping. That's BlueChew.com, promo code BUCKET to receive your first month free. Visit BlueChew.com for more details and important safety information. And we thank Blue Chew once again for sponsoring the podcast. So, guys, before we dive in to this 53-man roster projection, do want to remind folks about our training camp fundraiser. It's going on right now, streamlabs.com/thefalcoholic/tip. All donations this month are going to that fund. We appreciate it. Check out our Patreon and all that other good stuff as well. If you prefer Venmo, you can do that on my Twitter. It's at FalcoholicKevin. And I do, of course, want to remind folks about our very exciting event. We'll be hosting our first Falcons fan gathering and live show at Sweetwater Brewing Company in Atlanta on July 28th. That's Friday at 6 p.m. It's going to be a lot of fun. I'll be joined by Adnan Ikic, Will McFadden, Gina Kelly, perhaps some other secret guests as well. We'll see what happens over the next couple days, but we hope to see you guys there. So if you're interested, hit us up there. There's a Facebook event for it. There's also some tweets and stuff if you're wanting to let us know that you're coming. And it's going to have a special as well from Sweetwater. It'll be 10% off food and drink. And I know for a fact they've got a lot of great local craft brews on tap there. So you don't want to miss that. We hope to see you guys there as well. So let's dive in to one of the nerdiest articles we do every single year. And that is the 53-man roster projection. Now, remember, folks, typically you keep 3 special teamers. So that leaves 50 spots for the offense and defense. And I'm planning, and right now we're still going to do a 25-25 split. Some teams do 26-24, especially if you have injuries. Sometimes you have to carry extra of one position or another. But for now, we're going to stick with 25-25 and see if anything changes over the course of camp. Starting with quarterback, still going with 2 here for now with Desmond Ridder and Taylor Heineke. No changes going into training camp. Obviously, Desmond Ridder is the unquestioned starter. Doesn't seem likely to change at this point. Taylor Heineke is a quality backup, right? Provides that solid starting play if needed. But the ceiling is sort of just well known with Heineke at this stage. It just, what you're getting. It's going to be a guy that's probably going to get you to 500, and that's valuable if you need someone to carry you for a few games and not have the bottom fall out of your team. But I think we know that the ceiling of the team is not going to be good enough with Heineke, and that's why he's a high-paid backup, but still an NFL backup. The big question really with this group is whether or not the team decides to carry Logan Woodside on the 53-man roster. We do have that new third quarterback rule. I don't know how eager the Falcons or other teams will be to carry that third quarterback if they weren't already planning to do it. The Falcons have carried a third quarterback at times under Arthur Smith. Sometimes they have, most of the time I would say they've gone with just 2. So it's really an open question, but considering the team likes to have a lot of tight ends and they probably would rather keep extra offensive linemen that are going to play, I'm not necessarily convinced that they're going to keep a third quarterback at this stage, but that is a consideration because that rule does essentially give you that free active player on game day. They can only play in case of injury, but we've seen how that third quarterback can completely, if you don't have that quarterback, it completely derails your team to the point where your offense is just no longer functional. So, that could be more of a consideration later in the season or when you get into training camp or that sort of, or not training camp, the playoffs. At that point, teams may be more concerned with keeping that third quarterback on the roster for those emergencies. For the regular season games, I don't know how big of a deal the Falcons will find it. So we'll see how that goes. Moving on to the next position group, it's going to be running back. And we're still keeping 4 here. I feel pretty comfortable with them keeping 4 running backs. But with Avery Williams going on injured reserve and Caleb Huntley almost certainly beginning training camp on the PUP, which is the physically unable to perform list, there's really a huge vacancy with the 4th running back now, where the Falcons actually only have 4 running backs that are healthy, period. They've got Bijan Robinson, obviously, who's going to be the starter, and Cordero Patterson, Tyler Algier, obviously going to play a major role as well. I would think that Bijan's probably going to get 15 or more touches a game. Algier's probably going to get 10 or more. Patterson's going to be that sort of sprinkled in guy. Maybe he gets more snaps as a receiver. We'll see. But really, those top 3 are pretty much set, and they have been for a long time. But right now, as it stands, there's an incredible opportunity for UDFA Carlos Washington Jr. to make this 53-man roster. He's technically unopposed at this point. I mean, that does suggest that the team has quite a bit of confidence in him, as they haven't rushed out to sign anybody else. But we're going to see at least one more running back signed after Caleb Huntley's put on the PUP list. Maybe even 2, because unless you're planning to give Washington and that other running back all of the carries in the preseason just to split between those 2 guys, you need guys to take carries in the preseason. So you guys have heard me talk about this on some of the other shows, but I really like Dontrell Hilliard, who was most recently with the Titans, Justin Jackson, most recently with the Lions, both players that I think would fit in really well as a depth running back that could step in if needed. There's plenty of running backs out there on the market, so they don't necessarily have to rush out to get someone, but I do think before training camp kicks off, or at least before the first preseason game, we're going to see at least one running back added to this roster. But right now, Carlos Washington Jr. Has the best chance of any UDFA by far to make the roster just because he's unopposed. But I haven't seen anything of him yet. We'll see how he looks in training camp. Maybe he really is that good. This team does, of course, have that history with Caleb Huntley of basically finding running backs. as UDFAs and turning them into contributors. Fullback, pretty simple, right? Just one guy here, Keith Smith. I still think he's the heavy favorite to win the job because he's a great special teamer. The Falcons and coordinator Marquise Williams clearly value that a lot, that special teams unit. I think this team knows they're probably still going to be in a lot of one-score games this year, and the special teams plays can make all the difference in sealing those wins or turning those into losses. So that being said, I do think Clint Rakovich is probably the most intriguing, interesting, talented fullback they've brought in to compete with Keith Smith thus far. But I think he would have to prove himself to some extent on special teams to earn the job. And, again, Rakovich is more of that like weapon type fullback, like, Kyle Juszczyk, Pat DeMarco. He's not as good of a blocker as Smith historically, but if he's worked on that a lot and gotten better in that area, I think he is a guy that could really be an impactful fullback in the NFL. I just haven't been able to see him at this point. So we will see how he looks in training camp. And I do think he's got the best chance of anyone, John Rain, the other guys they brought in over the last couple of years to displace Keith Smith. But Keith Smith's been the fullback for a long time for a reason. Moving on to tight end. No reason to change anything here yet. Obviously, the first three guys, Kyle Pitts, Jonnu Smith, and Parker Hesse, are roster locks. There's not really much to say about that. They're all guys that have key and clear roles on this team. The battle is going to be at tight end 4, where we've got 2022 7th rounder John Fitzpatrick, former UDFAs Felipe Franks and Tucker Fisk in there as well. I think the team wants to let these guys sort of prove it and see if they can make their case for the roster, but I also wouldn't be shocked if we see a veteran brought in. Like, I think Michael Pruitt's probably on speed dial. I honestly would probably have just brought him back, but I think they really like John Fitzpatrick in particular, and I think they view him as a guy that is probably going to give them better blocking than Michael Pruitt. He's got the size that Pruitt doesn't have. That's really the one knock on Pruitt, is that he's sort of that wide receiver, like height and arm length in like a tight end's body, like thick, really thick wide receiver essentially, but he's a really good blocker. So if John Fitzpatrick can prove that he's a much better blocker and a capable enough receiver, he's going to be cheaper, and he's a lot younger, with Pruitt getting up into his early 30s. But I think Pruitt had great connection with Desmond Ridder, so if Fitzpatrick falters or these other guys aren't really impressing, I think we'll see Pruitt come back. And I would be happy to have him back. I thought he did a great job last year when called upon, and I think he's a good player, so wouldn't be upset at all to see Pruitt return. Moving on to wide receiver. Again, it's like this one is pretty set, the first 4. We'll see how entrenched these guys really are. But the first 3, I think, are entirely locked up, except, maybe Scotty Miller has someone displace him if one of these, like a Zay Malone, really stands out. I do really like Zay Malone, so I think there's a chance. But Drake London and Matt Collins probably 100% set. Honestly, Kaderil Hodge has a really, really good claim to that 4th spot because of his special teams ability. He was one of the best special teams players in the NFL last year. I think he had 9 special teams tackles. And he's just a good do-it-all receiver that he's not like a needle mover, but he's capable of playing outside, playing in the slot, wherever you need him, and he's just a good depth option there. So really, I think the 5th spot, possibly 6th spot, if they do keep an extra receiver, that's completely wide open, and it's fun to discuss, and I'm really excited to see how this shakes out. Honestly, I think I've changed my prediction to Josh Ali. He seems to be the one that's generated the most buzz in the offseason workouts. We'll see if that translates during training camp, but he does have some ability to return. He does have a good connection with Desmond Ridder because they played on the scout team together when Ali was on the practice squad last season. And even ESPN's Michael Rothstein called him Atlanta's surprise offseason standout. Ali, I think, suffered a knee injury late in the draft process in 2022, and I think the chemistry is clearly there. So he did average, I think, 14.8 yards per punt return in college as well, and got a punt return touchdown. Really peaked that last season, even though he didn't return a ton of punts. So he's got to beat out Mike Hughes and Penny Hart to actually win that job, and Zay Malone could be in that mix too. But obviously, if he wins punt returner, that's a ticket to the roster as well. So Josh Lee, I think I'm moving him into the favorite spot there, but I think there's a lot of opportunity for the aforementioned Penny Hart if he wins that return job, or Zay Malone if he really impresses. And then they brought in a bunch of other guys too. Chris Blair recently, JJ Ortega-Whiteside. So there's a number of guys here that all have a shot. It's pretty wide open. So we'll see. Frank Darby, I didn't even mention. So that there's a lot of guys that are going to be fighting over maybe one, maybe two spots. So it's going to be a really tough battle. We'll probably see 2 to 3 of them stick on the practice squad as well. But initially, I mean, it's going to be a tough battle for that spot. So hopefully that competition, creates a really better than expected 5th wide receiver for this team. And it's not just a bunch of guys who all are kind of That would be the hope, right? Moving on to offensive line. No changes to my starting predictions at this point. We haven't seen anything to make me shift. Matt Hennessy allegedly is still first team heading into training camp. That's not surprising. But I do think by the time week 1 rolls around that Matthew Bergeron will be the left guard. I have to think the team would probably be disappointed if he didn't win that battle. But I think Matt Hennessy also has improved, and I wouldn't really count him out necessarily. But either way, I think Matt Hennessy's spot is safe because of his ability to play center and guard. So I think that's going to be one of the more interesting battles to watch. Probably the most interesting offensive line battle, without a doubt. We did see the team make the decision to move on from Jermaine Ifedi, who I had sort of penciled in as the swing tackle. I don't know if we'll ever get the story there, but there's a lot of question marks now at swing tackle. I still think that Josh Miles, the veteran, is the favorite. He hasn't played a ton, but I think when he has played, he's been average, which is nothing to shake a stick at for your swing tackle in the NFL. If you're playing like an average starter, that's not bad at all. Behind him, I tend to think they will keep 2 tackle, or at least 2 tackle types that can play tackle in a pinch. So at this point, I think we're looking at a couple of guys competing for that, right? I mean, Barry Wesley, Tyler Vrabel. I do think it's probably going to be Ethan Greenidge at this point. I don't really have anything else to go on other than my gut. But I do think his time with the Saints, he's been in several training camps. I think he was a guy that actually made the Saints roster and unfortunately got hurt before he was able to see the field. But he has NFL experience. He can play tackle and guard. I think that will help him stick on this roster, and I think he's an intriguing guy as well. So that is the 25 offensive players. We will move on now to the defense, starting with edge. So I'm going to be going with 6 edge rushers once again. And this math, you can sort of fudge it however you want. Like if you want to say Calais Campbell's technically an interior guy, you can. I think he's going to play most of the snaps at edge. That's why I have him listed here. But we'll see how this shakes out in terms of where guys actually line up. But I think at this point, I sort of see them having to keep 6 edge rushers because there's just, who do you cut? I don't think you cut any of these guys. So no changes to the guys I initially predicted here. Like I said, the question is, are they actually willing to keep 6 edge rushers? And I think there are ways to do it. So, and I think that, part of it is that 2 of these guys offer position flexibility. Campbell, like I said, probably can place him on the interior. Lorenzo Carter can maybe place him at linebacker. I talked on the linebacker episode last week about D'Angelo Malone possibly getting cross-trained at linebacker. Aaron Freeman originally brought this up, that Caden Ellis, the Falcons veteran addition at linebacker, he was originally an edge, like an undersized edge rusher that converted to off-ball linebacker when he got to New Orleans. And now going into that same defensive scheme with Ryan Nielsen, having a guy like Caden Ellis here could be a good mentor for him. The Falcons are clearly looking for that type of linebacker that can rush the passer too. So maybe Malone could be a good backup for that sort of role, can play some edge, can play some linebacker. There hasn't been any official rumblings that that's going to happen. That's just an idea. So maybe if you've got Carter and Malone who can pitch in at linebacker, that can allow you to sort of change your roster math a little bit and keep that extra edge rusher out there. But we'll have to see how that shakes out. Because right now, unless they're willing to cut someone with guaranteed money, Dupree and Carter both have, I think, over $2 million guaranteed, or a highly drafted young player like D'Angelo Malone or Zach Harrison. I mean, they have to sort of keep these guys. Like the other option is to cut them. So they're not going to last on the market, I'll tell you that. So I think they sort of have to keep that 6. And I like it. I think there'll probably be, game day inactives in this group, probably 1 or 2 at least. But that depth is really valuable over the course of a season, especially when you're a team that's struggled to generate pass rush. I think you need that depth. You need to keep these guys fresh. You need to have options that aren't practice squad players if one of your guys gets hurt. Now moving on to the interior. This is where I did shed a player. I had originally had the team keeping 6 edge rushers and 5 interior defensive linemen. So I think they probably are only going to keep 10 defensive linemen. I just think it's hard to keep more than that with the math elsewhere on the roster, particularly when you're looking for like special teams players. So I had to say goodbye to Joe Gaziano. I really like him. I think his fit is really good here. I'd really like to find a way to keep him, and maybe the way to do that is, like I said, maybe you label D'Angelo Malone as a linebacker and he sticks as the last linebacker, and then now you can keep an extra defensive lineman. Maybe you can work something out like that to do that, but otherwise I think it's tough to keep a 5th interior guy if you're keeping that many edge rushers, especially when one of them in Calais Campbell can play on the interior if needed. So I think the top 3 here, Grady Jarrett, David Onyemata, Taquan Graham, Eddie Goldman, they're all roster locks. The nose tackle job is the one that's sort of completely up for grabs. Eddie Goldman, have to think, is the heavy favorite if he's healthy and ready to go, but that's a big question mark. The team, to the point where the team has now brought in 2 other competitors for nose tackle with last year's UDFA Timmy Horn and veteran Carlos Davis to challenge him and push him. So this is one of those where it's like Eddie Goldman will probably either like stick through the preseason and then it's like, okay, he's probably going to win the job, or like he'll just be unceremoniously cut in the next couple of weeks. And then we'll have our answer. Like he wasn't ready to go. So we'll have to see, but they liked Eddie Goldman enough to keep him this long and to give him a chance to get back in playing shape, and we'll see. But Eddie Goldman is very talented. He's played at a very high level in the NFL before, but even if he's just sort of an average NFL nose tackle, that's not bad. He's not like he's making a lot of money. He's the most experienced. I'd be happy to have him, certainly. So that's the interior group. Moving on to linebacker. This is where I have the change. We're going to see the Falcons keeping a 5th linebacker here. And part of that's just because I think ultimately you need that special teams player, especially with the team only keeping 4 safeties. You just need another core special teams guy. Typically those guys are linebackers or safeties, and I think they've brought in enough special teams focused linebackers that I think they're planning to keep a 5th guy for special teams work. So that's where I have that. I'm pretty confident, obviously, Caden Ellis, Troy Anderson as your starters. Michael Walker as the 3rd linebacker, that's more open, but I think he's more likely to be the guy. They haven't really brought in any other like veterans with starting experience. So it seems like they're penciling in Michael Walker to be that primary depth piece rotational guy. We know he's a good coverage player. The only question is, like, are they interested in reclaiming that $2.7 million if they were to release him? That's the bigger question mark, but I don't think they need the money, so they're not really going to feel pressured to do that unless somebody else just outplays him at this point. And then I've got some changes here with the guys I'm predicting. Dorian Etheridge seems to be fully healthy. He's been making plays and turning heads throughout the offseason program, so I'm bumping him up above Nate Landman. And then, like I said, I think that the Falcons brought in these special teams focused guys because they want those special teams guys out there. So, Andre Smith Jr. and Tay Davis, I think they're fairly similar. They're both really good special teamers. Smith Jr. is more of like a coverage focused linebacker. I think his run defense has been pretty bad. Whereas I think Tay Davis is a little bit more well-rounded, not really I think Andre Smith Jr. is actually a good coverage linebacker, whereas Tay Davis is sort of just mediocre in terms of his defensive play. So I think you lean towards keeping the specialists. They're both good special teams players. Like Andre Smith, maybe you can make him a sub-package linebacker or utilize him in that way. But it's possible they do value that run stuffing more. So maybe they go for Tay Davis. But right now, I'm leaning towards Etheridge and Smith Jr. winning those last 2 spots. And the Falcons going towards the 5 linebackers. But maybe, like I said, D'Angelo Malone gets that conversion to linebacker or starts playing more snaps off ball. He takes one of these spots and then throws the math off completely. So we'll see how that shakes out. At cornerback, still keeping 6 here, but we do have a little change at the bottom. So no changes to most of these predictions. I do think the signing of Trey Flowers shuffled things a little bit. So AJ Terrell, Jeff Okudah, D. Alford, I think right now I have slotted in as the starters, and that's a change. I think Alford right now is the favorite over Mike Hughes. So I did lift Alford up in the rankings as a result. But I do think that somehow Mike Hughes is like safer because of all of his guaranteed money, and he's on a 2-year deal. So like, that take that with what it is. But I think D. Alford's probably your slot at this point. Then we have rookie Clark Phillips III, and like I said, Trey Flowers as the 6th corner. But no matter what, like the Falcons are going to have to make some really tough decisions here. We're likely to see at least one of D. Alford, Darren Hall, or Trey Flowers cut at this point. I mean, given Alford's status as the favorite for the slot, he seems pretty safe. I do think Flowers' ability as like sort of that unique matchup cornerback against receiving tight ends helps him carve out that role. He's also a really, really good special teams player, and we know, again, how much the Falcons value that. So that does make things pretty tricky for Darren Hall, who hasn't really played a lot of special teams. He's more than deserving of a depth role. I think he's actually a fairly good corner, and even has some low-end starting potential, but I think he could be the odd man out here, just given how the team has sort of structured this room with all the guys they brought in. There may not be a spot for Darren Hall, and he's not going to stick on the practice squad. So I don't think it's necessarily an indictment of Darren Hall's skills, but he would have to prove himself, I think, on special teams to beat out Trey Flowers for this final spot. I won't say that he can't do it. I'm just interested in seeing if he can do that. But I also think Trey Flowers, like I said, his ability to be a matchup specialist against tight ends, where he's actually quite good, definitely helps him. He's very not good at covering receivers, so there's that. He needs to play more of like a safety role if he's not going to be covering a tight end. But they did bring in Flowers, so I do think that he's got a shot here, and I like his specialist ability. But we'll see how that shakes out. It's definitely an interesting one to watch, and we're going to be saying goodbye to at least one good player in this room, which is honestly is a good problem to have. Then we move to safety, where I've got no changes. Jesse Bates the third, Richie Grant, Jalen Hawkins, and DeMarco Helms. The big question is, like, do the Falcons elect to carry a 5th safety? Do Micah Abernathy, who was getting some reps with the starters early in the offseason, or XFL standout Lucas Dennis, maybe they show a little bit more in camp than the 5th linebacker or the 6th cornerback or what have you? At this stage, I sort of see 4 as the most likely outcome, but they could shuffle the math a little bit. They could maybe they list Trey Flowers as a safety and carry an extra corner, or they shed a linebacker or whatever it is. But at this point, I think they keep these 4, and I think this 4's it's gonna be tough to displace anyone in this group, unless Helms doesn't show out. He is a draft pick. It's only a 7th rounder, but I tend to think that he brings physicality to this group that none of the other players really have. So I think he'll find a way onto the field for that role, like as sort of the enforcer. But again, we'll see. I do like Lucas Dennis a lot. I think he has potential to sort of surprise and make the roster, but we'll see. We'll see. So that's the 50. Now we move on to special teams for the last 3 spots on the roster. And there's not really a lot to talk about here. Kicker Younghoe Koo, punter Bradley Pinion, and long snapper Liam McCullough, the Highlander. I know some people were having like questions about why the team give a 2-year deal to UDFA kicker Matthew Trickett. I mean, it's a little bit odd, but it's not meaningful, I don't think. I think they were just trying to give him a little bit of extra signing bonus to convince him to come in and kick for them in camp, maybe convince him to stick around on the practice squad. Maybe they just like to have Matts on the roster. That could be a holdover from the previous regime, right? They just need a Matt in the wings at kicker just to make them feel comfortable. So I wouldn't rule that out either. But I'm also briefly going to touch on returner just because I think it's an interesting battle. These guys have already been counted like as roster players. Obviously, Cordell Patterson at kick returner, and then at punt returner, I'm still going with Mike Hughes here. I think that we've got a number of guys competing. Like I said, Mike Hughes, Penny Hart, Josh Ali, Zay Malone, and Scotty Miller. But I think Hughes has the most potential of anyone in this group. He was an elite returner in college, hasn't gotten a ton of opportunities to do so in the NFL when he was expected to basically be a starter. But I do think he's got that potential, and I think he could really surprise and take that job by storm. If he doesn't, there's Hart, Ali, Zay Malone, whoever. There's guys that are going to be chomping at the bit to get in there. get that job. So that's the 53-man roster, folks. I hope this was informative for you. And like I said, this is mostly off vibes, right? Because we haven't seen these guys practice. I don't live in Atlanta, so I haven't been to the couple of OTAs or mini camp sessions that were public, and you can't really learn much from those anyway because most of the veterans aren't there and they're not going full speed. There's no contact, whatever. So this is just a best guess, right? To give you guys an idea of who I think the early sort of favorites are based on stats and based on their history. But anything can happen at training camp. If you're a Falcons UDFA or a young player that happen to be watching the show, don't be discouraged by not being picked to make the roster in the pre-training camp projection. You have a great opportunity to do so. Just do what you got to do. Get out there, prove yourself, because this regime, I think, has shown that they're very willing to give UDFAs spots on this roster. We saw it with Timmy Horn last year. We saw it with Nate Landman last year. D. Alford wasn't really a UDFA per se, coming from the CFL, but they're willing to give you an opportunity, and you have a real chance to make this roster if you win the battle. So I think, don't look at these lists as like they're set in stone. Anybody can sort of jump up the list by playing well. And unfortunately, we're going to see injuries. Hopefully none are serious, but that's the way things go, and you need to have good depth. So, I think there's a lot of guys that have really good shots to get on the practice squad. And as we've seen also, that's a path to the roster for this team over time. So really interesting roster, probably the most exciting training camp in recent memory for this team. And I'm really excited to get down to Flowery Branch and see these guys in person and hang out. And if you're going to be there as well, definitely say hi at camp. I will be hanging out. Like I said, if you're wanting to contribute to the training camp fundraiser as well, streamlabs.com/thefalcoholic/tip. Definitely get involved on Patreon if you're interested in taking part in our patron fantasy leagues. It's patreon.com/Falcoholic Live. Those will be forming right here in the next couple of weeks. If you enjoyed the show, please do like and subscribe. Really appreciate that. Leave a comment with any of your surprise roster players, any guys that you think are going to surprise and make the roster. Maybe guys I didn't touch on, maybe guys I did touch on. And yeah, if you're listening to the podcast audio, be sure to leave that 5-star review. Really appreciate that as well. Guys, again, thank you so much for tuning in to the Dirty Birds and Brews podcast. We hope to see everybody out at Sweetwater Brewing in Atlanta on July 28th, Friday at 6 p.m. It's going to be a lot of fun, so we hope to see some folks there too. And it's finally here, guys. Real football, and can't wait. We're so close, so tantalizingly close. So excited to get down there, excited to see some real football and bring you guys all that content that I know you're desperate for now after several months of basically nothing here in the NFL. So once again, thank you guys for tuning in to Dirty Birds and Brews. Today's episode was brought to you by betonline.ag. Until next time, guys, have a great day.